Karl Hughes was working for a startup in Chicago during the global pandemic when the company decided to reduce everyone's hours by 50%. With less to lose, Karl decided it might just be a good time for him to start up his own business. 1 year on, how is Karl finding it with his startup? What lessons has he learned? And how can you apply those lessons to your success? Let's find out. All right, we better get into this so that otherwise we're going to say a lot of gold and haven't really done the proper intro or anything. But
Sure.
thank you so much, Karl, for agreeing to be on Insights into Success. Super cool to talk to you and really interested in hearing from you. And what I want to hear for a start, there's a couple of things I want to talk about. But first, I kind of want to for you to share with us a little bit about your story and how you've come to be where you are now, and what exactly you are doing now. And then we're going to tap into some gold from you in terms of a couple of little topics. So if you could kick it off by just giving us a bit of a background.
Yeah, absolutely. So for the past almost 10 years, I've been a software engineer, engineering manager, and most recently a CTO at a really small startup. So that's a lot like being an engineering manager where I'm hiring a team and making architectural decisions and things like that. And then last year when COVID struck, I sort of decided to, well, in a way was forced to take a bit of a pivot in my career. And we can dig into the story if you want to as we go. But now what I do is I run a niche content production agency. So we're called Draft.dev. And what we do is we write technical content like blog posts and tutorials aimed at software engineers. So this is like an industry that a lot of people don't really even think about existing because it's happening underneath the hood. But
Yeah.
every piece of software you use is built on all sorts of tools and complicated, SaaS products that software developers use.
Yeah.
And so this market is of software developers buying tools to build better software is really big and growing. But the challenge everyone who markets to that market has is how do we reach software developers with content that is technically accurate and interesting? And so what we do is we connect software engineers that want to write with companies that need software engineers to write content for them. And then that's kind of our whole thing. We have a whole process built around that, and we work with about 40 clients now. We've got 7 full-time people and writers and editors in, I think, 27 countries now.
Wow. So first question I want to ask there is, how competitive is it, in your niche there? Is there many other people out there doing what you're doing?
No, there's very few content agencies as specialized as us. One of this idea of like content produced for you by a third-party agency is obviously not new. There's tons and tons of companies that do that and do it for all sorts of different verticals and areas. But with my background in software engineering, I got asked all the time by companies if I would write blog posts for them, just because I was writing on the side for fun. I'd written I self-published a book a couple of years ago. And so people knew I wrote. And so they'd ask me all the time, like, do you want to write for us? And I knew there was a ton of people that were interested in this. I didn't really know how much demand there were until we kind of got into it and started pitching ourselves as a business. But there's not a ton of competitors that do exactly what we do for this tiny, narrow niche of the market. And so that does help us stand out, and it kind of makes us a little bit, we don't get into a lot of direct competition battles.
So, okay, so this is interesting. So from your point of view, right, okay, you've decided that you're going to go out and write content specifically for software engineering. 2 questions come to me from that. One is, and I'll take them in proper chronological order. What made you go from just, okay, I'm just going to write this content myself, have this little job just for me, versus, hey, I'm going to scale this thing? Because in life, it doesn't matter what we're talking. We're talking software engineering here, but it could be a butcher shop. It could be anything. There are people out there that will just go out and do their thing and not think about doing anything more than just that. And then there's other people that are always thinking on a grander scale. So my question to you is, why was it that you've decided to go to the grander scale as opposed to just you typing away on your keyboard on your own?
Yeah, that's a good question. And honestly, I still kind of debate it with myself internally, like how this is like, I think a lot of times you hear entrepreneurs talk and they act like they've got it all figured out. Like
Yeah.
I don't.
Yeah. Good on
So
you. Good on you for being honest.
I'll tell you why I'm currently doing what I'm doing, and then kind of talk about some of the other side of this. So my dad owned a small business, basically most of my whole life growing up. It was an antique store that he ran with a couple of friends, and the business was basically their lifestyle. Like they wanted to be there every day. They loved dealing in antiques and talking to the people. They basically were just friends with every customer that came in, and so for them it was very much like, we just want to work in the store, and the easiest way for us to do that for the rest of our lives is essentially to buy the store and own it. And so that's what they did. And I think that is a perfectly viable, valuable way to run a business, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. A few years ago, though, I kind of got into, as I was working with startups, I read a book called The E-Myth, and I started to see a lot of things that I saw as challenges my dad had as an entrepreneur, that I thought, there's probably another way to do this. And again, it all comes down to your priorities. But for me, what I thought about was, I'd like to build a system that didn't require me to sit in the driver's seat every day for the rest of my life. Like maybe I'm still relatively young. Maybe in 10 years, I want to shift and do something different. Or maybe I want to take a 4-week vacation at some point. And if you're essential to your business, then there's no way that that's going to happen. So at this point, I've been trying to build Draft and design it around, like, could I take a random day off when I want to and have the team take on most of the work? Or could I take a week off and not have to shut the store down, essentially, which is what, if my dad and his partners, if they all want to take the same week off, they're not going to open, right? That's essentially how it worked. There's kind of pros and cons to this. I actually read another interesting book, I think last year when I was starting this, called Company of One by Paul Jarvis. And he talks a lot about the merits of having a small business that is essentially just you, and then hiring maybe freelancers to fill in some of your gaps or using services. And so that's a perfectly legitimate approach. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. But obviously you sort of have to decide and pick a side, because at some point the decisions you make will vary depending on which route you've decided to go.
Yeah.
So wanting to have a day off was my big bonus for going this way. Yeah.
And does that mean that you don't get to write much content anymore, that you're mainly just focusing on coordinating the team?
Yeah, that's right. And this is one of the things that I think Michael Gerber is his name, who wrote the E-Myth, talks about a lot, is that, a lot of really good practitioners go into business for themselves thinking, well, I'll get to practice my craft even better because I have no restraints. And so his example is a baker. They open a bakery, and they've sort of realized that in order to make the bakery successful, they actually need to stop baking bread. And that's the irony of running a business, is like, if you want to get bigger and successful and grow beyond you, you have to stop making the bread, and I have to stop writing the articles. So I think I got out of writing completely 2 or 3 months ago, really. So it's still pretty recent, but I was winding down. Started off day one a year and a couple months ago. I was writing every piece, started to hire freelancers to fill in some gaps for me, and then slowly replace myself with more of them.
And just on that topic, how have you found it bringing in freelancers as opposed to, just having full-time employees?
We've done both. Yeah, we've done both. So there's pros and cons, and there are certain things that make it cost restrictive, I guess, for us to hire full-time around. So to kind of give you some insight into our business, like, because we write content for super specialized areas. One software engineer that we work with on one article may not know enough about another topic to go write that second article. So we kind of, by nature of this, need a lot of specialists all around to cover all the gaps. So part of the big reason for having almost all of our writers now be freelancers is that they kind of need to cover a lot of different ground, and there's almost no way that one engineer could write all these different kinds of topics. On the other hand, it is really valuable to have full-time people that are interested not only in executing tasks, but in the long-term success of the business. And that's kind of where we draw this distinction. We have our freelancers who kind of come in, they're executing a task, they're getting paid, they're hopefully enjoying the work, but they're not really, if at the end of the day, they're not invested in Draft.dev success in the long run in a big way. Whereas our full-time team, very much so, because that's what gets them a steady paycheck and their job next week and next month and next year, and benefits and everything else that comes along with it. So that's how I try to write that line. And it kind of depends. In a service business where you've got this wide range of stuff, we kind of have to just have pretty big freelance workforce.
Yeah.
But we could do it differently if we were set up differently too.
I think one of the things we've sort of agreed we want to talk about is how to find an idea and to hit your first 10K and scale it further fast. So obviously with what you're doing, tell us a bit about that and your thoughts on how do you work out what is the idea to go with and how to really start to get it to move fairly quickly.
Yeah. So there's another book that I'd read years ago called Good to Great by Jim Collins, kind of a business classic. So a lot of people read it probably in MBA programs and things like that. But I had a professor in college that recommended it. And one of the things he talks about is this thing he calls the hedgehog concept, which is basically you want to work at, or your organization will do best when it's operating at the intersection of the thing you're good at, like a world class at, something that drives your economic engine, in other words, makes you money. And then what's the third one? It's like the thing you enjoy doing the most or brings you fulfillment. I can't remember the way he puts it, but something in that vein.
Yeah.
And so looking for, I think, I think a lot of entrepreneurs approach product market fit or finding an idea as like just purely what does the market want. They kind of ignore the fact that they would hate doing this thing for years, which is really important. Like because a lot of entrepreneurship. All my mentors that as I got into this, I started building up a kind of group of mentors who kind of gave me advice. That the one thing that was clear from all those conversations was you have to outlast the hard parts. And so the thing that's key there is you have to really like what you're doing and care about the customers you're serving and the people in your team. So if the key is lasting the longest in order to survive and keep the business running until you figure out how to make it actually work, that element of doing something you could be really good at and something you enjoy doing is also really important, not just the economic part.
It's kind of like paradoxically, in order to make the most money, you actually need to not focus on the money, but focus on what you really enjoy doing. So long as there's obviously an economic market for it.
I think you can't say ignore the money, right? Because clearly, like there's people out there that, I don't want to bash any career professions, right? Like, but let's say, if you're an artist and you love creating art and you do it for 20 years straight, it's still a tough world. I mean, like I know friends that are musicians that they still play music, like gigs, and just they're not going to make it big, like it's not going to drive their economic engine. They're always going to have a day job.
Yeah.
Now, there's nothing wrong with that. But like, if you're thinking about like, I want to go full time on this business, there definitely has to be an economic component that works in some demand or some way that you can meet demand in a unique way, I think.
Yeah. And the thing is, though, that like it doesn't matter what business it is, you're inevitably going to have real challenges. And it's through that passion and what you're doing that you'll get through it. Whereas if you're doing it just purely and simply for the money, then there's a pretty good chance that you're just going to lose. You're going to run out of steam because you're just like, I'm over this. I don't even like doing it.
And I don't know a single entrepreneur who's gone from standing start to running their own business and made more than they could have outside of that business in the first year or two. Eventually there's like this some graph where eventually you run it long enough and you eventually do get to where you make more than you ever could if you're really successful. But like the majority of entrepreneurs, I think the average salary or something for entrepreneurs is $70,000 US a year, which is fairly good, but not, I mean, it's not incredible. And if I compare that to like what my friends as software developers are making, it's not good at all. So it's really interesting to see, people get into this and think it might be for the money, but you might want to hold off. That doesn't always happen.
Yeah, that's right. So for you, what's your advice for people about how to find the right idea for them? So it's got to be something they like, something that's got an economic potential, but you might have a number of ideas out there that kind of fit that bill. How do you choose the right one?
Yeah, there's a few other constraints that I would think about. One of the big ones for me personally, and I like to just speak from personal experience rather than try to give generalized advice because it's so hard. Everyone's situation is different. For me, I have a family that I'm at least partially responsible for helping provide economic, engine to. So I have a young son who's 2 and a wife who's awesome. And she's worked a great steady job, which is a big part of why I could do Draft.dev and take this risk. But to kind of like go back to that, I didn't have 2 years worth of savings in the bank to just say like, well, I don't need to make money for 2 years. I'll just figure it out. If on the other hand, you do have that, or you go raise money from investors maybe, and you do get a big bucket of cash to work from, your situation and the kinds of businesses you can start are totally different from someone in my situation who didn't have that. And so for me, I knew that I'd have to start a service business because they typically can have a quicker time to get a paycheck out of. I knew that worst case, I could just kind of freelance, and that's just fine. There's nothing, plenty of people do this every day. So in a way, it was like, what level of risk, financial risk, can you tolerate? Just realistically speaking, is a big part of that equation. Yeah. I think but what I did was instead of thinking like, I'm going to come up with this great idea that's going to be infinitely scalable, the problem I posed in my mind when I went on this was, how could I make a full-time living that was livable in 6 months? Because that's kind of how much time I have here.
Yeah,
I don't have forever. Yeah. And so it really limited my options, which is a good thing. You kind of want to constrain yourself rather than trying to look at the world and say, oh, well, I could build anything, especially when you're a software developer, you could write the code for anything, but it could take you years, and we don't have that time. So,
yeah. And do you think, though, that in some ways that it's actually a benefit to be like that? Like if someone said to you, look, I'm going to give you a whole bucket of cash, whatever you need, you can have it. Do you think that's actually going to bring the best out in people and actually optimize the potential results?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a tough one, because that is sort of the whole premise of angel investing and venture capital investing, is that by giving really smart people a big amount of money, that they're going to do something significantly faster than they would have without that money, or get it bigger. I won't say that it doesn't work, because a lot of our clients are in that boat of like venture funded startups, and they are making it work and they're doing really well. But it is a kind of a all or nothing sort of game that you play. So you either hit it really big, or you go to zero within a couple of years and you kind of start back over. And if you have that risk tolerance, or maybe you've got enough personal, sort of in the bank, like cushion in the bank, that you feel comfortable doing that, or you feel like, if I had to go back and get another job, then you don't mind that. That's all fine. I think for me personally, when I was getting started with Draft, I kind of was looking at this as like, how could I kind of work for myself forever? Like, what kind of business, again, could I start that would just kind of work in the future, and regardless of external funding, or regardless of whether we hit it big or not. It was sort of like, what's a sustainable lifestyle kind of business? And this just kind of eked into, like, along with what are my skills and what do I like doing, this kind of like all fit that sort of bill.
Yeah. And do you, like, with doing this, do you kind of go forth with the idea that, look, I'm doing this right now, but that may not be where I end up ultimately, and I need to keep my eyes wide open at all times, my senses very attuned, and this is where I'm going, but I could end up over there, to the left or the right, but that's okay. But the most important thing is I'm out there doing something, and who knows where that's ultimately going to go.
Yeah. Isn't that the scary thing about life, though, is that you only get so many years, and you never know if you're on the optimal path. Like, I mean, you could ask yourself this: no matter how successful you are, you could always go back and say, like, is this what I should be doing forever? And like, there's no right answer. No one can tell you that. So I don't know. This is actually something when I went self-employed, a couple things I did. I started building up a group of mentors, people who had started businesses that were 5, 10, 15 years ahead of me, that really, like, I could kind of ask these hard questions like this, like, well, how do you find your purpose and direction? What are you doing it for? That was really helpful. The other thing I did was joined a couple of peer groups where we talk more about the day-to-day of, like, we're in it, in these early days. And both of those things were really helpful for getting perspective. I think maybe if I had one thing that's helped me the most with staying level throughout this whole process of starting a business, is like getting perspective from people who've been through the ups and downs, or people who are going through the ups and downs, is super helpful. And if you're doing this alone, one of the first things I would try to do is just build up a little network of other entrepreneurs going through this, so you can kind of talk about these things and hear each other's stories. Because again, there's no right answer. You're just going to have to talk about and think about these things every once in a while.
Yeah, and it's a good way to keep you sane and keep you in perspective, isn't it? And when you hear their stories and realize, well, mine's not so bad after all, and okay.
Right. I mean, exactly. I hear stories from mentors who now look so successful, but they're telling me about times they had to miss payroll for 3 months because there just wasn't money coming in, and they had to let their best people go because they just were falling apart, or they didn't get paid for a year. Like you hear these stories all the time from entrepreneurs, and you can take all the steps you want to avoid them, but you're kind of stepping out there, and it might happen to you someday. There's so many factors that come into this. So it's helpful though to get that perspective and think like they went through this and now they're on the other side and they don't regret it. They say that this was still worth doing. It was just hard. And I think that's where you kind of want to end up. It's like, okay, this is going to be hard, but it's probably still worth doing.
And I think that's an important message to get out there, though, too, because often the media, they kind of don't want to tell everyone about the hard part of the story. They just want to do the overnight success story. So it's like, it's the old cliche, overnight success just took 10 years to get there or something. Yes. You know what I mean?
It's so true.
Isn't it?
No, and so many of the stories about the well-known entrepreneurs you hear about, you don't hear about the many years of sort of smaller successes or like, sort of mid-range successes they had leading up to that big one. You hear about Elon Musk's going to space or something, but you don't hear about the like 30 years or 40 years of entrepreneurship that he's been through, where he's had some companies that weren't that great and some that were excellent and extremely, valuable. So like, even a guy like that, he's on his fourth or fifth big company. It's not like this is his first time around. And I think that's so rare that a first-time entrepreneur hits one that's like a home run, proverbially. It's much more common that first-time entrepreneurs are doing kind of small but get good starter businesses. Whether that's something like we're doing at Draft, we're in a really niche market, or we're kind of running it as a lifestyle business, a service. I still look at this as like, it's a great business, but maybe it is just my stepping stone to something different in the future, or maybe I decide I do want to run with it forever. I don't know.
Just see what happens. I'll tell you an interesting book for me was I recently read the Nike story, so about Phil Knight. And the thing that struck me about it more than anything else is that it took a lot of years before they were like really safe and secure, successful. Outwardly, they might have looked like they were successful. They had this huge tax bill overhanging them, that they didn't know where that was going to go. And, could they end up being destroyed by their competitors? And this whole thing with what was a duty? It was a duty tax to be imposed because of the style of their shoe and all this stuff. And I'm like, holy heck. So for a long time, you think there's this big successful company. And in actual fact, it was on the edge of going under. And so it took a long time before they got over that and could truly be a successful company. And it's like, wow, that was really eye-opening for me.
Yeah, I heard that somebody who was just talking about this was mentioning how the first few years that Phil Knight was running Nike, he had a day job. He was like doing it on the side because he just—
That's right. He's an accountant.
Didn't get there. Yeah, it's like when you hear that, you're like, oh, this isn't like, so, a lot of times I think you hear these stories about indie hackers doing side projects and you think that's a new phenomenon. No, this has been going on a long time.
Yeah.
And this is kind of how entrepreneurship is. It's this gray line. And even in my case, like we kind of glossed over this part, but a big part of the reason I started Draft was that the previous company I was working for hit the rocks during COVID and put all the engineers down to half-time. And I said, well, I've got half-time. This is kind of a perfect, if you're going to go start a business, you got a half-time paycheck. That's a nicer place to be than a zero paycheck. So I'll do this now and I've got some time. And that was a huge enabler. And if I had kind of realized how well that would work, I might have tried to go half-time earlier, or even, done that as my next job was to be something part-time and do, my own business on the side. So anyway, just something to think about is like, there's always this transition period that's really hard to get through as an entrepreneur. And if you can supplement your company with a day job or half-time day job or consulting or freelancing, that can be huge.
Yeah. And it comes back to what we talked about before though, doesn't it? That you've got to be passionate about what you're doing, because otherwise you're just not going to make those sacrifices and really push the envelope to achieve, to be successful.
Yeah, definitely have to like it, and you have to like the people you're doing it for and doing it with. I think there's a lot to be said for liking your customers and caring about their success, because ultimately every business is built on making their customers successful. Whether you're selling shoes, making people feel like better athletes or actually be better athletes, or you're selling, in our case, like content marketing or blog posts, and you're trying to help companies do better with their marketing results. In any case, like it's about making that customer feel successful or be successful. And if you're doing that for people you don't like or respect, you can lose interest pretty quick.
Yeah, it'll become a struggle.
Yeah.
sort of, biting your tongue, grin and bear it kind of thing is only going to last for so long before you just run
Yeah.
out of steam on it.
Yeah, I think so. It would for me. I mean, maybe everybody's different there, but I do feel like you really do have to respect the cause a bit of what you're doing. Again, you don't have to be purely altruistic or starting a nonprofit to just care that, like, I want developer marketing teams to do better because I think they can help expose developers to new products. But that's, yeah, anyway. I agree.
So tell me about so far. What have you been the lessons that you've learned so far, and in that maybe there's some mistakes that you've made you might be able to share with us. But what have you learned so far in your journey?
Yeah. So we've grown really quickly, and along with that, the biggest challenge is hiring and all the challenges that sort of like spawns off of it.
Yeah.
So, it's gone from myself alone a year ago to now having, 7 full-time people. I think we'll have 8 in mid-October. So, this is really like picked up fast. And then we have over 100 writers. And so that's a huge pool of these freelancers that we work with. So the biggest challenge for us has been managing like customer demand as it goes up and how many people we need to hire to service that demand, and how do we stay profitable and cash flow positive, because we're not raising money either. So, it was easy when there was just like 1 or 2 of us, and I'm like, well, I could just, skip paying myself for a month to get ahead on payroll, and like, yeah, we'll be fine. That now it's like literally more money moves through the company every month than I normally have access to. It's a really scary, weird thing. And you hear entrepreneurs complain about like getting bigger and how hard it is, but it's mentally taxing. Like, I'll just tell you, like, it's a kind of a scary place to be when you don't, you start to have other people's paychecks kind of like dependent on your success. There's an element of this that, it doesn't keep me up every night, but it's definitely one of those things that I think about a lot. It's kind of a background thread through all. So that part, I didn't really realize how much that would grow as we grew. I think I thought once we get past that initial phase of just getting off the ground and we have customers, it'll all be easy then. It'll just be like a walk in the park, but it is not. It does not get easier. It's just different. Yeah.
And so how did you get those customers? How has it grown so quickly? Has it largely been word of mouth, or how have you done it?
Yeah. So a few things, and I tallied up the stats back in July, and I'll have to pull that up. But essentially, the big ones are word of mouth. So people either referring us. We had a couple early channel partners that were really helpful. So what we do is a good supplement to what an SEO consultant does or a content marketing consultant does. Typically, they'll go into a company and they'll say, here's what you should write about, but they don't actually do the writing. They just kind of give you a book, like a playbook, essentially. And the challenge a lot of companies have is, well, how do we execute this playbook that we just got paid, 20 grand for? And so now they come over to us and they say, could you guys help us execute on this content plan? And that's where we sort of like focused initially, especially. And so that was a big one. We had a couple SEO consultants that started giving us some business, but then as we did good work, the clients would refer us to other clients. That was huge and still is huge, to be honest. Word of mouth is big. In any service business, I think if you don't have word of mouth, there's a problem there, because clients are almost always talking to each other. And for us being so niche, it's even more true. So for example, the companies, a lot of companies we work with are, they're in developer marketing, and it's this small world of just a few. There's just a few conferences. There's just a few people who really do it and specialize in it. Just a few podcasts they all listen to, or newsletters they all subscribe to. So it just ends up making everything a lot easier when the market is really small. So that's been the big thing. And then now we've started, as we've grown, we focus more on SEO. So we want to be in the top 10 results for a lot of the key terms in our industry, just to make sure we have presence. And we're able to start focusing on advertisements in newsletters, doing like conferences and events, start doing that. Just anything that gets us out there and continues to have more touch points with that same small group of people. But so that's what we see today.
Yeah. So your growth, that's all been self-funded. You basically just plowed the profits back in order to then be able to recruit additional people.
Yeah, and part of the challenge, the thing I'm still figuring out, is how we essentially enable customers to fund our growth. So this is one thing that's a bit tricky to pull off in some businesses. Like I have a friend who runs a cookie selling business, and it's really hard to get customers to prepay for cookies you haven't made yet,
Yeah.
right? Because nobody's waiting around. They want the cookies when they order them.
Yeah.
In our case, though, we can wait to hire editors, writers until the client has locked in a contract and ideally made their first payment. Usually we have clients on payment plans. And so, maybe their first of 2 or 3 payments comes, and then we start hiring and recruiting and getting all that ramped up. Now, it does get trickier with full-time hires because sometimes we need them to kind of be onboarded before we've really got the clients. And we're kind of going through that now with hiring account managers to service all the new clients who want to start with us. And essentially the clients aren't quite paid yet, but we have to get the account managers onboarded before the clients can, really get on. And so it's this chicken and egg problem.
Yeah.
This is a part of a growing business or any business that you want to self-fund. And even if you take investor money, you still have to think about cash flow. It isn't, it's different maybe in those cases where you have a big chunk up front. But yeah, it's something to learn about.
And so with your type of clients, so they typically they'll sign up for an extended period of time. So you've got a revenue stream for a period of time. It's not like a one-off, one article. It's like they're signing up for you to do bring them content for the next 6 months or 12 months or something.
Yeah, I mean, almost. So when we started and it was just me, I could do one-off trial articles with clients because it was just me and there's no risk in that for me. Just figured it would be one article to do. But now that we have a whole team that's invested in every client, we absolutely have to have longer commitments than, just a couple articles. So our current commitments are usually around a quarter. And when we renew a client, we usually will offer a discount for 6-month commitment or something like that. So it just kind of depends. We're pretty flexible still, but quarterly helps a lot because we can play in capacity for 3 months out. We also kind of know that, the client's going to pay at these set points. And so there's the ability to predict a bit more in cash flow. So that's the big one. And I think if anybody who's starting a service business, it's easy in the early days to just get started with small trials, but you need to move away from that as quickly as you can and as quickly as your reputation allows. What's interesting too is that as you get more exclusive and tell clients we only take deals X big and this is our minimum price point and all as these things go up, clients actually kind of respect you more. And part of it is that bad clients self-select out, but part of it is also that serious agencies do at least quarterly commitments and charge at least 15, 20 grand a month commitments and stuff. So if you're not playing in the serious agency space, they look at you as, oh, well, you're kind of just a freelancer. We can treat you however we treat our other freelancers, which means we pay you 90 days after we get the work, and you will only do one article at a time, and just they'll set the terms. You kind of want to get away from that if you can, and it's hard. I mean, I'm still figuring that out too, but this is definitely something that's helped a lot as we've grown.
So you've got a software background, you've got a lot of people to manage, you've got to have a good software infrastructure in place to manage this all, surely. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, we actually use almost exclusively off-the-shelf tools. So to get specific, we use all of our content is managed in a database called Airtable, which is a nice visual database system, kind of like a spreadsheet plus essentially. And then we hook that up to automation that runs through Zapier, which is a automated email. You can do all sorts of automations with it. So for example, when we match up an article to a writer, Zapier picks that up and automatically zaps them an email that says, hey, you've just been matched to this article. Click here to confirm it. And then there's a automated thing that the writer can do to confirm that. And that just all in our system is happening behind the scenes without us having to do a bunch of the back and forth. And this kind of becomes essential once you're doing more than 50, 60 articles a month. We really needed this. And now we're double, triple that. We absolutely have to have stuff like this. We wouldn't be able to do what we're doing without, we'd have to have twice as big a staff or something if we didn't automate some of the stuff. So, but the advantage to no code and low code tools today is that you don't need a full-time developer to kind of set that stuff up. You can usually get somebody who's semi-technical, or even I still do a lot of it now, to kind of get those things going. And you get a lot of value for very little financial input compared to hiring a full-time engineer, which is a huge, that's a big financial commitment.
No, that's definitely expensive. Yeah, I'm familiar with Zapier. We call it Zapier.
I still don't know how to say it.
No.
So
I'm sure I think it's an American company, so I'm sure they would say that you pronounce it correctly. But this is just the translation down at this part of the world. We'll call it Zapier instead of Zapier, however you
I
pronounce it.
also heard somebody call it like Zapier, I think. And I was like,
Oh,
that can't be right. Are they
I
French?
haven't heard
Maybe.
that
I
one.
don't know. So
Okay,
honestly, if somebody from Zapier wants to join in and chime in, let us know.
slightly off topic, but what the heck? There's a car manufacturer. This is a very big difference. I think you say Subaru.
Yes, we do.
Say Subaru.
Subaru is how
Yeah,
I would say
we
it.
say Subaru.
Wow, I did not know that.
Pretty different.
That's hilarious. It's
Oh,
like the
there
way
you
we
go.
say Sbarro, which is a pizza place.
Sorry.
We say there's a pizza place here. We call it Sbarro.
Ah, right.
You might call it the same, but it's funny you pronounce
Yeah,
Subaru more like our Sbarro.
Subaru. Yeah, and you
Sbarro.
were saying niche before, whereas we say niche.
Yeah.
You're
That's one
very
I'm.
niche.
Yeah.
So,
I hope your audience can understand most of what I'm saying.
oh, absolutely. Look, we're bombarded with American television and that, so we're fully accustomed. It's more a case of you and whether you need translation at all. We're just this little tiny country down in the bottom of the world. So,
No, I watched Flight of the Conchords. We get your TV too.
oh, okay. We don't have too much of it, but it's the odd bit like that.
Yeah.
So, with service businesses, what is the biggest challenges that they face they need to overcome in order to succeed?
I think the biggest one is like the owner getting out of execution. Like, so most of my friends who run service businesses, they still are very actively involved in day-to-day production. I was really, because I knew that was the biggest hurdle to get over, I was just very intentional about like pulling myself out. And why that's so hard is that when you start hiring freelancers and other even full-time people, they're going to start at probably 75% of your ability. And it's so hard to let a task go at under your potential when you know you could do it better yourself. It is, everyone struggles with that. So the key there is you have to know that and just accept that that is the way it starts. But ideally that person will get better and eventually eclipse you and allow you to like focus on the big picture problems of building the business. And so it's interesting, as we've hired people, we've had to move away from some of the early clients that wanted to work with Karl exclusively, like me exclusively. They were sort of like, oh, we like having this guy who's write every article for us. And as we got bigger, I kind of had to let those clients go, which was tough too, because they were good clients, good people that I liked working with. But it's just reality for the business was I couldn't be involved in articles every week anymore. So that letting go of the day-to-day, the execution is really hard for a lot of entrepreneurs, but it's mostly a mental battle because in service businesses, I won't say that quality doesn't matter. It absolutely does. But there's a bar where once you cross that level of quality, then the real thing that clients want is just consistency and good communication and to like you and believe in you, trust you. And it's not nitpicking every little sentence you write in an article. It's much more about, do we trust this brand essentially to bring us value every week? And that's kind of where, once you realize that, it unlocks a lot of potential for you to grow. And now the challenge, the next challenge that I'm facing that is common to all service businesses is getting out of sales. So the next hard thing for service entrepreneurs is, you take on sales because you're like, okay, I'm out of execution, and somebody though needs to sell this thing and needs to be the one on the phone and drumming up new business and the face of the company. And that's great. You're going to have, like, I have so much, like, that's my main focus. And so I get a lot of business because of it. But at the same time, if I'm the only one who can sell it, it means when I take 4 weeks off, we stop growing, and that's not where we want to be. Ideally, I'd like to get us to a point where I could, if I had to, leave for a month to take a paternity leave, let's say, and be able to know that things were just running. And so this is the next challenge that I'm sort of facing and living in right now. And we'll see how that goes. Maybe do an update in 6 months. I'll tell you.
And tell me, in terms of, and especially because of COVID, with your business, do you actually have a physical office, or everyone's working from home and then you just connect up via, video conferencing when you need to?
Yeah, we started during COVID, and so we are fully remote and kind of plan to be forever.
Yeah.
We also are largely asynchronous, and that's by design as well. When I say that, what I mean is like we try not to have too much real-time communication where everyone has to sync up at the same exact moment in
Right.
time. And because we have people all over the world now, we have employees in Europe and Southeast Asia and the US, and so getting our time zones to overlap is especially tricky. So, for example, we try to have like one in-person meeting per week for each function of the business, and then we try to have one monthly all-team meeting, and that's kind of it. A lot of our other communication happens via, we use a tool called Status Hero, which is really great for kind of these asynchronous daily updates, and a lot of comments in Trello and Airtable, and a little bit of email to kind of make sure everybody's got what they need. But the other thing too is like our business is not, there's rarely these like, this is on fire, you need to stop everything and go do this moment. It's a lot of times like, I mean, if somebody gets an article a day late, it's not the end of the world as long as we're communicating that well with the client. So we're in a unique spot there. But we did kind of go into, I went into this kind of thinking, I want it to be pretty flexible. I want to give people a work environment that allows them to have that kind of, oh, well, I can take the afternoon off and it's not going to be a big deal. I'll just start earlier tomorrow, or I'll do something this weekend, and like, that's fine. I do that all the time.
And what about building culture within the company? How do you find that, given you're spread so far geographically and with the time difference, which, as you say, inhibits your ability to really have a collective get together? How do you build the culture?
I don't know. This is another one. So you're asking all the good questions, because like, this is one that I'm literally, it's on my plate struggling with right now. And I've been talking to the team about it, obviously, because I'm very transparent about how we run and the kinds of things we want to do. We've just started setting like a sort of coherent mission and values around what we're doing here and who we're hiring and all that. And so that sort of starts to set the pace for culture, but I don't think it is culture in itself, right? That's just a like kind of a maybe an indicator that you're thinking about culture. So I think we're trying to figure this out. And we've been talking about like, do we want to adopt some kind of real-time chat tool like a Slack or something? Like, we don't currently use one, maybe just for fun conversations. Like when somebody sees a funny joke or like they want to put a meme out there. I would like to have that sort of thing happening, because it means that we've got like some camaraderie. But at the same time, like, I also kind of don't want to build an environment where everyone feels like they have to be available 24/7, especially when we've got people all around the world that might comment at 9 p.m. at night. But, I don't expect the people everywhere to always look at that.
Yeah. It's a challenge, isn't it? It's an interesting challenge. And I think with time, you just got to work through it, I guess, and see what works for you. But you're trying to get that balance, because you want to give people that flexibility in their lifestyle. But at the same time, you want to make them feel like they're part of something bigger, part of something special, and that they're an important part of it. And there's, other, people around them that are part of that journey too, and you're all working collectively together.
Yeah. And you also have like, I mean, again, like running this kind of all remote worldwide company is not easy. There's cultural differences that are very real between how we do business in the US and how people in other parts of the world might do business or might go to work, might treat their work in general. And if you are not aware of those, you can kind of get yourself into this spot where you're holding people to expectations. They're just not culturally normal. And you start to, I think it's getting less so. When I first started working with remote engineers 10 years ago, I helped manage a team in India, and there were very real cultural differences that were tough to work around. I find that a lot less now, even though it's still something happening. I think there's more people who have gotten used to like either adopting a Western or European culture, or that's kind of gotten more pervasive, or we've all kind of understood the middle ground of like, here's what we do and why we do it. So again, I don't know. I don't think this is an insurmountable problem, but I do think it's one to think about if you're an entrepreneur going into like, I want to build a worldwide business. Just think about like, what cultural norms are you going to be kind of enforcing, or should you just try to leave it very open?
Yeah. And just to kind of wrap this up, what are some things that come to mind, some key pieces of advice you'd like to impart on people that are aspiring to set up their own business? Or what's some things for them that we haven't already talked about that they should be aware of, and maybe shortcut them to getting to where you are, but without maybe making some of those mistakes along the way?
Yeah, it's so, again, like everybody's coming at this with a different background and mindset and resources. So I'll tell you what for me sort of pushed me over the line. I used to worry a lot because my past experience was with funded tech startups. And so I worried
Yeah.
a lot about the idea being very unique and very like scalable and all these buzzwords that funded tech startups worry about. And I used to think like, oh, if I don't pick something like that, it's gonna be a waste of time. Like there's no point doing a business that's just a like a small boring business. Once I accepted that that was okay, and then instead of focusing on cool and unique, I focused on what would allow me to sort of make a living within 6 months. That was like literally the constraint that I was under. It got a lot easier, to be honest. Like sort of that built these walls where I was like, okay, well, that means you can operate within this zone. And if you go outside of this zone, it's funny. I mean, it's interesting. You might like want to explore that a little, but like that's not really where you're gonna make a living in 6 months. So it kind of kept me really focused.
Yeah.
So I would think about that as like, could you set yourself some constraints that are realistic? Like say, I want to be full-time on my own business in 6 months, see what that does for your, like the ideas you come up with, the way you pursue it, and the way that you sort of like, just sort of cut the employment off. And now that once you've done that, and like, even in my spot now, I've been running this business for a year. I've done sales now. I've never done sales before this. I've done, managing people. I've account managed. I feel so much more equipped to run any other business. And not saying I could just immediately do anything, but like, if I feel a lot more confidence than I would have a year ago if you'd asked me this.
Yeah. And do you think that that's an important thing for a business owner to actually have experienced the different facets of the job so that they have a better understanding for, when they start to grow that business?
Yeah, I kind of think a lot of business owners are very T-shaped. They have a wide range of experience, but then they know one thing really, really well, really deeply.
Yeah.
And that's kind of their like, maybe their core expertise, but they have to be like, I think this is where a lot of big companies don't set you up well for entrepreneurship, is they sort of want you to be really deep, especially in technical fields like engineering. If I were a software engineer at a big company, they'd have me working on one tiny sliver of the code base, and I'd get really good at that, but I wouldn't get exposed to like accounting or finance or sales or marketing. Whereas when I worked in startups, yeah, sure, I was responsible for the code base, but like I was sitting next door to the marketing people and the accounting people, and there were meetings that crossed over. And so like there's a lot more learning about the whole business. And so something to think about if you're on the track of like, I want to run my own company someday, is like, how do you start to learn about those functions outside of your core knowledge, just to a point where you could like have a conversation about them, or at least hire someone who could do those better than you.
Yeah. All right. Well, sounds good. Well, thank you so much for that. It's been really interesting, actually. I'd be keen to stay in touch and talk to you in 12 months' time or 6 months' time, and see what pearls of wisdom you got to share with us then, and how your perception or point of view might have changed during that time. So yeah, that'll be interesting. But thank you so much. I really have enjoyed it, and I've learned lots from it. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. This is a pleasure, and it's really fun listening to your podcast. Just the varied conversations and all. I've enjoyed the last few episodes. So
cool.
Keep it up. Yeah.
Thank you.